So yeah, I'm glad to be here. Very happy to be here. My name's Noé Hatchful, and I've been asked to kind of talk to you all about operational problems in technology, which is something I have a lot of experience with because disaster response work in general is all about just solving a bunch of really complicated problems. And I do have a lot of experience in technology as well. So I understand that this is probably one of your last lectures of a course. So I'm excited to be kind of the capstone on that, to be last. And what I'll try to do is over the next hour or so, kind of give you a sense and show you kind of what disaster response at the international level really looks like and feels like, and some of the problems that we face. Just a couple things about myself. I'm currently a senior field operations advisor for the USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Before that, I spent 7-8 years as the American Red Cross's senior field operations officer, which meant that really I was one of those people that would get on a plane and fly out to the worst disasters in the world and try to get something going, try to set up humanitarian assistance for affected people all over the world. And when I wasn't doing that, I was in headquarters kind of leading a strategic decision-making process about, do we send people? Do we send stuff? Do we send money? How much? When? All of that kind of stuff. And I was also in charge of kind of readying these emergency response teams. They're ready to, jump on a plane with me and go out there and deliver humanitarian assistance. Before that, I spent over 10 years working with the federal government, largely on domestic work. So as you can imagine, I spent, I think, 8 of those years with FEMA, traveling all over the country. I think I've been to a good chunk of the states at this point. And I also worked with EPA's Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. And I also have a little bit of time in the UN system as well. So I've got a little bit of experience in the NGO world, the federal world, the international world. So Dr. Otegwe here has been nice enough to kind of invite me to come talk to you about kind of my experiences and what it's like. And I'm actually glad that it's kind of a smaller group. I know that there will be some people who watch a recording, maybe, but as a smaller group, it means that we can interact a little bit more. So I'm glad. I don't see your names, but what I'll do is, if I ask a question or something, or if you have a question, just raise your hand. It's going to be tough for me to present. Oh, I do see your name. Never mind. Take that back. It'll be tough for me to look through the comments and present and all of this stuff all at once. So I apologize for that. Let me see if I can share my screen. Let's do this one. Okay, all right, so you guys are over here now. Okay, so before I go on, can everybody see the screen that I'm sharing? It should be a picture of me in my Red Cross vest out in the desert, basically. All right, cool, excellent. All right, so a little bit about what I do, and to be clear, one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here, and one of the reasons that I'm willing to do this, is because when I was in college, there was no program like this. I remember going to my advisor. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I knew I wanted to do international work, but I thought maybe development, maybe diplomacy. I don't really know, and doing international disaster response work never once came up. Humanitarian assistance work never once came up. I went to the College of William and Mary, and I got a graduate degree from University of Virginia. Never once did this type of work come up, never once. So I never had anybody even suggesting this stuff to me. There was certainly no kind of course of study around it. It just wasn't a thing. And I've noticed in the last, maybe 10 years that it's becoming more and more a part of various curriculum and programs, and I'm very, very excited about that. And because this industry, we need more humanitarians. We need more people to do disaster response. And I don't just mean firefighters and police officers and EMTs and paramedics. I mean, of course, I've got all the respect in the world for these folks, but we need a lot of people to do international work. So if I can get the word out a little bit, and maybe one of you will be like, hey, that really kind of speaks to me. And if any of you get interested in this, I'm happy to be here for you to advise you, talk you through it. Any questions, not just during this presentation, but afterwards. You can see on the screen there, I'm sharing like my email address, and there's not a whole lot of no way hatchables out there. So, I'm not hiding. So feel free to reach out to me at any time. Let's see, a few other small things just to know about me. Let's see, I was born in France and I emigrated to the US, so I'm a binational. And you'll find that like in the international humanitarian world, there's a lot of us like that, these like weird expats who kind of lived all over the place. So there's absolutely that. I've lived in lots of different cities in the US. As I said, I've traveled a bunch, both domestically and internationally. At this point, I think I've worked on every continent except Antarctica. And that's one of the cool things about the job. I mean, it's probably one of the hardest jobs on earth, no joke, but you get a lot back. And that's a big piece of it, as I have experiences all over the world, which is a lot of fun. So you might be asking, well, how does somebody get into this kind of stuff? Like, what do you need to know to do this kind of work? Well, one, the international part is not entry-level work. I've been working my way up through over 20 years. So you need a whole range of different knowledge, skills, experience, right? You need like technical skills, right? Maybe you're into like mapping or into data management, or maybe you're an engineer. Who knows what your technical skill is. You also need kind of like the ability to like all these soft skills. You got to talk to people. You got to use your soft skills to negotiate things, to get things done, right? And then you also need some ease, kind of working in pretty tough conditions, whether that's, a foreign country that you've never been to that has a bunch of historical and cultural differences from where you grew up, or whether it's like a completely destroyed environment and you're kind of dealing with some pretty tough stuff. You need to be able to kind of be effective at a high level, despite these challenges. So enough about me. But let's see if I can actually change this screen here. Oh, okay, good. So here's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And as I said, we'll go through it. I'll kind of go through it as quickly as I can, about an hour. Again, if you have questions, raise your hand, and I'll see if I can get to them. So we'll talk about what role. Well, let me throw a few disclaimers before I dive into it. One, I'm going to show you guys a bunch of pictures. I don't think most of the pictures. I think a few pictures might be a little disturbing, maybe, but I've really tried to curate this, so I'm not showing you dead bodies, or I'm not showing you anything like that, right? Most of these pictures that you're going to see, I either took, or I'm in them, or I know who took them. So they're, and maybe there might be one or two that I pulled off the internet just because I needed something to kind of demonstrate a point. All right, so that's it on the pictures. I will, as I said, I'll try to answer questions the best I can, and from time to time I'll ask for like small feedback, right? So if you don't mind, please leave your camera on just so I can see if I'm not, going crazy. So I might ask you to like give me a thumbs up here and there. In fact, let's see if we can try that out. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, excellent. So that's kind of like how we'll flow for the next hour or so. So what are we going to talk about? So this class is about operational problems in technology, which is a super broad topic, and I can't speak to all the operational problems out there because disaster response work is just a series of solving operational level problems. So I'm going to focus more on the international disaster response type of work. I've done a bunch of domestic, but I'm sure you've had lots of speakers, and I mean, I'm really impressed with the speakers that I've seen on your program. These are some high-end folks, and I'm sure they've covered a lot of really, really relevant topics in the domestic space. Plus, I think a lot of topics and themes that I'm going to talk about apply in a domestic context as well. Second of all, I'm going to focus more on the telecommunications and the tech side than on just operational problems writ large, because there's a lot out there, and I wouldn't really know where to start. So we'll talk about what role technology plays out in the field. We'll talk about like what kind of tech we use out in the field, humanitarian practitioners and professionals. And then of course we'll talk about what goes wrong. What are the common problems? And Murphy's Law absolutely applies in disaster response. If it can go wrong, it definitely will. And it'll go wrong in a way that you can't even begin to anticipate. That's another part of Murphy's Law that most people don't know. But then, of course, we work through it. We've got an important job. And it doesn't matter if we're tired or sick or something doesn't work. We still have to do our job, or people die or people suffer. And that drives us to solve these problems. So we'll also talk about like how we actually deal with it. So let's talk about the role that technology plays in disaster. And as I said, I'm going to focus more on communications technology, but technology is all over disasters, right? I mean, no matter where you look in a disaster response, you're going to see technology. On the top left here, you can see this is a Canadian field hospital. I mean, these are incredible field hospitals. In 48 hours, they can be anywhere in the world, and they can set up a full hospital, NICU, OR, ER, full pharmacies. That is some pretty impressive tech. Not just the medicine, but even just the process of getting it out there, right? You'll also see on the top right, like there's urban search and rescue, and as a member of Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, that's one of the things that we do, is we deploy American urban search and rescue teams abroad, US 1 and US 2. One is out of Los Angeles and the other one is out of Fairfax County, Virginia. Tons of tech, not just like really cool tools and drills and saws, and they are cool, but they even got like robots that can like crawl into debris, like robots shaped like snakes, like tennis balls. Incredible tech in that world. WASH. Give me a thumbs up if you know what I mean when I say WASH. All right. Yeah, WASH stands for water and sanitation and hygiene. It's one of the most important things in the disaster response world, right? Fresh water, sanitation, hygiene. Look, a big nasty concrete slab is a scary, scary thing during an earthquake. But way, way, way more scary is cholera. Way, way more scary are diseases and that get in the water, right? We all know about Zika, chikungunya, dengue, malaria. If you don't clean up after disaster, there's gonna be outbreaks of that. So that thing in the bottom left, that's a kind of a water purification system. And some of these things, and this is kind of a simple, small one, it can turn like a muddy pool into acceptable, clean drinking water. And some of the larger ones that we've used in Africa and in Asia, they can purify between 20 and 50,000 liters of water a day. That's a lot of water, right? So there's a lot of tech there. There's a lot of chemistry there. There's a lot of engineering there. And I say that because maybe some of you are like, well, I'm going to be an engineer. Disaster response is not a field for me, something like that. Nonsense. We need engineers. Engineers and tech is all over what we do, okay? Not pictured on here, but of course, super important is, well, actually, as you can see, there's also logistics. In the bottom right, that's a bunch of vehicles that we had that were arriving in Nepal. So there's tons of tech and logistics, right? Not just these massive planes, not just warehouse and inventory control systems, but you see tech all over the place in logistics as well. Now, I don't have a picture of it because all the pictures are kind of boring, but public health, as I said, everybody is all about urban search and rescue and your local firefighters and your local, police. But, the biggest killer on earth is a mosquito, right? Malaria kills 630,000 people per year. And mosquito-borne diseases in general kill over 1 million people per year. That's a lot more than earthquakes. That's a lot more than hurricanes. So our public health professionals, I mean, they don't get nearly the love that they deserve, right? And they are using all sorts of technology to track epidemics. They customize technology for communities that don't have access to like fancy data. All throughout Africa, there are community health advisors that have simple little feature phones. That's what we used to have before smartphones, that can actually like text, like we've got 2 more cases of people with runny diarrhea or with chest coughs. And our public health people can use this technology to track epidemics. Also, our public health people use things like drones. You know how they use them? Sometimes, for example, during Zika, they would use these drones to pop up and look over on people's roofs to see if there was standing water, because that's vector control, because the mosquitoes like that standing water to lay their eggs. So even in the public health world, they're not just nerdy people with clipboards and spreadsheets. They use a lot of tech. Of course, you also see kind of like this very visible tech, like base camps, right? And the bottom kind of what you see, this base camp, this was from Hurricane Irma, which actually hit the United States. This is in the Keys. This is a base camp I set up with the Danish Red Cross, right? So you can go from an empty field, like what you see in the top left, to 4 or 5 days later, you've got a full-on base camp for 80 responders that have bathrooms and showers. That's some pretty cool tech too, honestly. We also use quite a bit of tech, in terms of our assessments, right? And we'll get a little bit more into that, but like we use all sorts of technology to assess what the needs are, to assess what the damage is. I'm sure it's easy for you to all imagine like using drones to assess damage from above, right? You take a look at like damaged roofs, you figure out kind of what the damage is. Well, we use that data to help us understand what the needs are, especially in the humanitarian space. A destroyed roof in and of itself is not that important. What is important is what does it mean in terms of people's needs, right? So damage and needs assessments. We use all sorts of tech, aerial surveys, drones, tons of GIS programs, and all sorts of very advanced data modeling, so that when we have a hurricane, a Cat 5 that hits a specific island, we can input certain variables like building materials, strength of the wind, storm surge, temperature of the water, and it helps us estimate kind of how big and how broad this disaster is going to be. So there's a lot of tech in that as well. But in general, I'll focus more on like kind of telecommunications tech, because that's kind of where I have a lot more experience than a lot of these other elements. Although I've been, doing this for 20 years. So I think at this point I've done just about every job in the field. So how does tech kind of build in? Well, initially it was a lot of big piece of our safety and security, right? For years and years and years, humanitarian work was these like self-sufficient teams that would go out into the field, and they would deploy, and 30 days later they would come back. And there was very little knowledge about what they were doing. It was very hard to get a sense of what was going on. Maybe you had some newspaper or some journalists that were out there. But we used a lot of tech in response even back then, a lot of radios, right? Because we needed to, ensure safety and security. So as you can see on these vehicles, these are kind of classic. The Toyota Land Cruiser is the noble steed of humanitarians around the world. Everybody has been banging around in these. And as you can see on the front, there's like an HF antenna, and there's usually a VHF antenna, but we use radios all the time. So in the very beginning, that was a big piece of how we were using technology. So we use radios, when you're driving around in a convoy, when you come to a checkpoint to check in, when you got somewhere. And HF radio, you can almost communicate around the world with an HF radio. With a well-placed radio and a strong radio operator, it's incredible what you can do with a radio, and it doesn't rely on cellular systems. It doesn't rely on satellite-based systems. Remarkably old, remarkably simple, remarkably effective. We also, let's see, do I have it? Yes. So this is kind of what the inside looks like. So the handset on the left, that's an HF handset. And on the right, that thing that might look like a CB radio, some of you, that's just a VHF radio. Okay, so that's just kind of what it looks like. As I said, one of the things I'm trying to do is kind of give you a sense of what it looks like. Now, it's not just radio for safety and security. We also use satellite-based communications, and increasingly so. So for example, this is a picture I took in Nepal after I think we lost him. And we lost track of all sorts of people. So this is that was a big piece of it, is just being able to communicate when cellular systems are down, when everything is down. So satellite systems like this give us connectivity anywhere in the world. Now, don't get me wrong, we use cellular, but there are times where we also want to have a redundant system. For example, I was in northeastern Nigeria, right? So there's Boko Haram, and the Nigerian government are really going at it in northeastern Nigeria. And what would happen is whenever there was the government was going to attack, they would shut off all the cellular towers to stop the ability of Boko Haram to communicate. So as a humanitarian out in the field, that creates some serious risks. So we use sometimes these satellite-based systems so that we're not dependent on cellular or on any sort of ground control type of thing. That's just one example, or some examples. As I talked about, we use tech, of course, for assessment and planning, right? So on the top right, you can see where we're using GIS technologies and aerial imagery to help us understand kind of like the scope and scale of the event, right? Look, the reality is, people like me who've been doing this for 20 or more years, we know what's going on when a Cat 5 hits a small Caribbean island, or when there's an earthquake at night in an urban area. We have tons of experience, but we don't just rely on our experience. We also have to bring in data, right? Because if we just relied on our experience, we might miss things. We would miss things that are new. We would maybe miss like kind of the scope or the scale of the needs. So what we do is we combine data and our experience. to make the best possible decisions when we're doing our planning. And on the bottom right is an example of using a very simple technology that's Kobo Collect, which is kind of based on Open Data Kit. And it's a way that we can put kind of a simple survey on people's phones, and they can go out and help us do damage assessments. And then somebody's sitting back at base, and they're seeing that data come in. And what you're seeing on the right is actually it's a real picture I took of a system that we set up where our team was doing a security assessment of the road in northeastern Nigeria. So every time they came to a checkpoint, they would pull out their phone and mark checkpoint. Every time they came to a destroyed bridge, they'd pull out their phone and mark destroyed bridge. And in real time, we're getting data about what the situation looks like out there. So again, we use tech all the time in our assessments and planning. Oops. Here's another example. So for example, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, well, one of the things that we did is we asked, hey, Facebook, can you give us kind of aggregated data of where a lot of people are like logging in from pre-Maria and post-Maria? So pre-Maria is what you're seeing on top, and post-Maria is what you're seeing on the bottom. As planners, this is incredibly useful. It tells us where there were people. It tells us where there are no longer access to the internet, where there's no longer access to power. So it helps us kind of orient where we want to go. So we use a lot of this data as quickly as we can to kind of plan our operations. We also use third-party data, as I said, not just Facebook, of course, and not just data that we collect ourselves, like surveys and stuff like that, but we collect data anywhere we can to help us make our decisions. And again, we're trying to combine data and experience so that we can, we know, should we bring in, tarps and food for 100,000 people, for 200,000 people, for 1 million people? Like, what are we talking about here, right? So that's how we try to combine those types of things. Disaster data, this looks pretty cool, right? I would love it if this was like our command centers, but actually this is NASA. In the real world, it looks more like this. That's really what it looks like. There's a bit of a kind of an inverse paradox, which is like a lot of the coolest tech is actually as far from the disaster as possible. So the reality on the ground is it's a bunch of people getting together, sweating, or freezing, or soaking, exchanging information, smacking mosquitoes, coordinating, sharing data. And this is kind of what it looks like. It's late nights around a table after a long day banging around in the back of a Toyota Land Cruiser. It's sweating in a swamp in Florida under a tent. But this is where we get a lot of our data, right? We meet with other partners, other agencies on the ground, locals, especially locals. Let me reiterate that. Always, always, always involve locals in your assessments and plannings and operations, right? So this is more what it looks like. And on the top right, top left, sorry, that is in our base camp in the Florida Keys. In the top right, that's in Haiti after Hurricane Michael a couple years ago, or Hurricane Matthew, sorry. And the bottom left, that's in southern Nigeria after some floods. And in the bottom right, that was one of our base camps in Nepal after the earthquakes. And so, yeah, it would be great if it looked like this, but it's probably going to be more like that. That's kind of more the reality. That said, I've also worked in, the National Response Coordination Center out of Washington, D.C., and it looks pretty cool. It's got a lot of cool screens. And, those people are sitting in the air conditioning. They get 3 meals and air conditioning. And meanwhile, in the field, this is what people are dealing with. And this is really where a lot of this comes from. Let's see. A couple other things. We also, of course, use tech all throughout implementation, right? I mean, as I said, safety and security, we use radios and cellular for tactical communications. We use tons of technology to manage data, right? We're collecting tons and tons of data as we're working, right? We're constantly updating our knowledge about what's going on. We're constantly updating, our own data about what we have done and are we meeting our goals? We're working with the local communities as well to make sure that, we're implementing sustainable solutions to a lot of their most pressing needs, right? So there's a lot of tech that gets involved in implementation. Last but certainly not least is there's a lot of tech in terms of media. And you might be saying, well, the media, like they're just out there to make some money and, who cares and blah, 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 blah. But guess what? We need the media. We need them because they help us spread the word about what the needs are. They help us get the word out that there's tons of people dying or suffering and that we need assistance. And they help us generate interest from donors. So yeah, there have been times when I'm out in the field and we're all sitting there and we have very poor connections, and that media or that comms or that public information officer is like, I need to hog all the bandwidth for the next 30 minutes because I have to upload some crazy 2 gigabyte video so they can be on CNN tonight. And we're all like, yep, have at it, right? Because that matters. That matters. So you're generally going to see all sorts of tech all over the place. Now, one thing I have to say, and this is also part of a disaster response process, it doesn't get nearly enough attention because it's not super sexy, but it's super important. Just transition, right? At some point, international responders like me, we've got to leave. And so we have to be very, very, very careful and conscientious about what tech we bring in, what tech we use, and how we plan to transition out. I've spent a lot of time in Haiti, and they suffer all sorts of disasters. I'm sure all of you are aware of this horrific earthquake, right? But they also get hit by hurricanes nonstop, in addition to all the other indignities that Haitians have to face. So aid agencies show up there, it feels like every year. Feels like every year people can just book their ticket to Haiti. And you know what? A lot of them mean well, right? They come up, they bring super high-tech vehicles to move water all the way around the country. These huge trucks that can purify the grossest water ever. But then they all fly home. And what do you think happens to those trucks, right? They're very quick to just say, oh, here you go, Haitian government. Here you go, Haitian Red Cross. I can't fit this truck in my carry-on. So I'm such a generous savior that I'm giving you this $200,000 water buffalo. But if the local community doesn't have the resources or the technical knowledge to maintain those trucks, then that truck can actually be a burden. So there are entire graveyards of highly, highly sought after, expensive equipment and tech all over the world. And that is when that is a failure of the humanitarian community, right? If we're not planning our transition out, if we're not using technologies that are locally sustainable, if we don't have an exit plan, we're not doing our job. Any questions about any of that? All right, cool. Let me grab a sip of water here. Okay, so what tech do we use, right? If we have to be, if we have to find the correct balance between high tech that allows us to do our job faster and cheaper and better, but at the same time, we have to take into account, the reality of the context that we're working in and the population that we're trying to serve. Well, what do we use? Okay, so here's some of the kind of the classics. We use all sorts of different response tech, and I'll kind of get into some of the bigger categories. As I said earlier, there's health tech, there's logistics tech, there's water and sanitation and hygiene promotion tech, there's all sorts of tech out there. But these kind of core ones are really important. One, VHF radios. Look, is anybody here a ham? Give me a thumbs up if you've ever messed around with diodes and transistors and ham radios, right? It's pretty nerdy. And very, very few people in the next generation are working on this. It's a major problem, right? All of you, when you look around your room, there might be 4, 5, 6 outlets. You don't ask yourself for 1 second if it's going to work. That's not the case around the world, right? We are lucky in the United States. We have pretty robust infrastructure. We have access to electricity and access to fresh water. That is not the case in a good chunk of the world. VHF radios, man, they're burly. They can take a pounding and they work. They work really well. You can move data over them very slowly, of course, like super slowly. But VHF radio is still kind of it's a core technology that you'll see out in the field. And on the left, you'll see kind of like one of our masts that is often used for like a base station or hospital where, you kind of like, you're not moving. You get handheld devices like what you see in the middle. And basically anybody out in the field is like constantly trying to charge the radio. Anytime you get somewhere where there's a charger, you're putting that thing down because you need power. And on the right is my friend Jonathan, who's part of the Nigerian Red Cross, and he can fix just about anything. And you'd be amazed at how some of these things can keep running despite the conditions. Another big piece of the tech that we use is just IP and data networks, right, or internet. I'd say as recently as 15 years ago, disaster response teams that went abroad did not rely on internet. You know, a lot of clipboards, a lot of manual processes, no expectation that if you were in the middle of the Philippines or in Haiti or Nepal or in Bolivia, that you would have access to the internet. Well, not so much anymore. So nowadays, teams that go out in the field, they almost all expect or rely or build some of their programs around access to IP networks and data networks. So here's a few pictures of kind of the ugly reality of what it looks like. On the left there is kind of an office and a tent. And I know that's not pretty, but it works, right? That kind of stuff works. And on the right, well, actually, that's me in Nepal, and we are using kind of these like point-to-point connections that can go like literally 100 kilometers as long as there's a clear line of sight. And here we're creating a connection between the base in Kathmandu and a logistics warehouse up on top of a mountain. And they were getting all their internet from us in Kathmandu. And so they were able to like manage their inventory, request additional inventory, report out. It's very, very, very important that as responders, we are accountable for the money that we get, that we're accountable to the people that we're serving. And a big way that we do that is by collecting information and then reporting on that information. So connectivity is really, really important for the operation. How do we get connectivity, right? I mean, it's not so easy, as you can imagine. I know all of you are constantly making sure that your phones are trying to connect. And I bet you 99% of the time, living in the United States, that's not a problem. When you're at home or you're in your dorm, you got Wi-Fi, not a problem. You're walking around on the streets, you have 4G or 5G, not a problem. Maybe some of you have traveled around Europe, still not a problem. Your phone is connected nonstop. But here's the thing, once you kind of get away from that, it starts becoming more and more of a problem. It gets harder and harder. And after a disaster, and I'll talk more about it later, that becomes a big, big problem. How do we get connectivity at the kind of the farthest reaches of the world, the poorest countries on earth that don't have the robust kind of cellular infrastructure, for example, that we have in the US? So we use satellite-based systems all the time. Because as I said before, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, somewhere there you can connect to a satellite above you that can give you access to the internet and voice and data communications. So we use a lot of this stuff all the time. And the one on the top left, that's a really kind of small system that we use. That one's, it doesn't have quite as much bandwidth, but it's really easy to use. You like put a few things together, you literally hit a button, and most of the time it like auto acquires a connection to a satellite, does the job. And the bigger picture, that's actually on a rooftop in southern Haiti. And that's a kind of a bigger, more manual system, but that's what we call a VSAT, a very small aperture terminal. Okay, so if you hear me say VSAT, that's what I'm talking about, is one of these. And these give us worldwide capability to access data and voice connectivity. And they're connecting to satellites that are in geospatial orbit. So that means that they're so far away from Earth that they actually rotate with Earth. Pretty cool stuff. And it works anywhere in the world. If I have time, I will show you guys this video, but I may end up just putting the link in the comments later. It's a really cool video about how we use these VSATs in the most remote mountains of Nepal. Why? So that we could connect hospitals to other hospitals in Europe and in Asia. And that way, when doctors were treating injuries, they could actually send x-rays of injuries to doctors in Berlin, in Tokyo, and they could consult with their colleagues thousands of miles away, right? So you have doctors in the mountains of Nepal, and they're exchanging, x-rays of patients with doctors in Berlin, Ottawa, Toronto, and Tokyo. So, these satellite communication tools are good enough themselves, but they're even better when we allow other units to enhance the services they provide.
Do you want to play that video that way?
Let me try a little bit later, because right now, like, this link seems to be a bit fun. Oh, well, there we go. Are you guys seeing it?
Yeah.
Are you hearing it?
No.
Give me 2 seconds here.
Sure. think you have to use one of the functions in Zoom.
Yeah.
Don't remember what it is, but you have the option to share sound.
Apologize for sharing a video over Zoom. Who does that? Here we go. I want one thumb up if you can see it moving, and one thumb up if you can hear the voice.
A lot. Well, there wasn't as much damage in Kathmandu as there is at the outlying areas, and this area has a lot of serious damage, as much as I've seen in other areas where we've been installing communications. IT Telecoms is here. We're here mostly. The American Red Cross has provided some VSATs, and we have some donated satellite bandwidth from Intelsat that's available for not just the American Red Cross, but all of the International Federation Red Cross national societies that have projects here. So we're installing it wherever it's requested until we run out of VSATs, and which right now we only have one left, and that's designated to go up north by the Chinese border. So when that runs out, we'll continue to make the rounds. We heard that one VSAT that we'd already installed, they're going to relocate due to landslide. So we'll need to go out and reposition that and get that up and running again. So even once we run out of VSATs, we'll still be working, because this is still a very fluid situation here in Nepal.
So the reason why we're setting up this satellite dish is that it provides a much greater internet bandwidth and is cheaper to operate, so it's got a lower operating cost than the current system the Japanese Red Cross are using here. That's secure.
Here, there's very limited, even cell phone coverage here, very low, and only at certain times of the day can you really get through. As a hospital unit, they need internet communications to confer on medical issues. There's a IFRC medical software program that they need to submit data on and get updates on contagious diseases that may be going around. And internet is not just for morale here, it's also a necessity for them to do the job they're here to do. This is as challenging as it can get that I've seen so far in Nepal.
All right. Let's see if we can go back to this. Bear with me a second while I sort this out. Okay. Can you see the screen? Can you hear me? All right. Okay, so that right there speaking, that was Julie Bradley. She's a good colleague of mine, and she's one of the only female team leads in the ITT ERU community. So she's a pretty cool one, and you'll see her again here and there because we deploy her all the time, and I've deployed with her a bunch, and she's great. If you think she's a mild-mannered woman, you're wrong. She was a former lieutenant colonel, and she was one of the people that was overseeing like a lot of the how to put it, the removal of certain nuclear weapons in certain countries in Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 90s. Tough job, right? And now that she's retired, she's committed herself to humanitarian work. So she's a really, really good one. Now, we don't just use the internet and connectivity, of course, to help our own operations, which really does help quite a bit. But we're also recognizing more and more that after a disaster, yeah, people need food, people need water, but they also need access to information, right? I mean, I was in Germany when there was a bunch of Afghans and Syrians that were moving through Europe, and we had a line for sandwiches, a line for warm food, and a line to a generator to charge their cell phones. And the line for the generator was 15 times as long as the line for sandwiches. And that might sound crazy, but ask yourself, if you've been on the move after a disaster or crisis, and you have a chance to charge up your phone and call your family and tell them you're alive, or call your family and find out if they're alive, or grab a sandwich, which one would you take, right? I think the answer is, when you think about it, like, yeah, I would rather have access to that generator so I could charge up my phone. And I think in your generation, it's obvious that you would charge up your phone. So, I don't think I have to sell that point to your generation, but just to point out that in the disaster response world, this is a relatively new idea that access to information is an essential need after a disaster. And so, for example, this is a picture after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Remember I showed you that map earlier, that juxtaposed kind of like Facebook activity pre and post disaster. So what we were doing is we were using these satellite-based terminals to go to these small communities all around the island. And of course, they're totally blacked out in the dark. And we were turning on a generator and setting up VSAT and creating a Wi-Fi network and allowing people to reconnect with their families and loved ones. And it was one of the most important things I've ever done as a humanitarian. It might not sound like much, but when you've heard, somebody talk to their mother, find out that their mother is alive, or you've heard somebody talk to their abuela and let them know that they're alive and recreate those family links, believe me, it can even warm my cold, dead technology heart. Like this is what it's all about, this human connection. And this woman on the right, she wore this shirt, and it was probably the perfect shirt. We had to grab a picture with her. I don't need you, I've got Wi-Fi. And that seemed like that summed it up real well. Another technology that of course you see throughout the field is cellular. Look, I keep talking about how, well, you can't rely on cellular, sure, but you can sometimes. Some disasters destroy infrastructures and others don't, right? The population movement on Venezuela, there's no destroyed infrastructure there, right? So we can and do use cell phones and cellular technologies whenever possible. And to be clear, like a lot of these satellite-based systems, they're expensive and they take high-end training to use them. So whenever we can use cellular, we do. And as I said, this is an example of a charging station. Put out a few generators, throw a bunch of outlets out there, and people are charging because charge up their phones. And I'm sure you can all imagine yourselves in the same situation. Your phone gets to zero, I know you're panicking. I know you. So these people are all charging their phones, and we recognize how important that is as a humanitarian community. And of course, in terms of tech, power. All of this stuff requires electricity. And so that's an important piece of the technology that we use. So in the top left, you see some of like the bigger kind of trailer-based generators that we can use. So these were outside of a Canadian field hospital because they're powering a whole field hospital.
Can I cut you off for a second? Do you know of anybody distributing those portable batteries for phones, like in the humanitarian world?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a big, that, as I said, as the humanitarian industry starts to understand that access to information is an essential need, especially for people on the move, right? Like you get hit by a hurricane, okay, you're gonna be on the move a little bit, but you're not like leaving your country. But like Venezuela, Syrians, Afghans, Iraqis that are just on the move, they need access to information and they need access to electricity. So we're seeing more and more humanitarian organizations that are giving out SIM cards, that are giving out those little power banks, either solar or non-solar, so that people can not only charge their phone, but then they can charge it again later when they're farther away from some of the response teams. And we do that. That's a key piece of our kit. I never go anywhere without a power bank in my backpack. And I have my field one, which has like solar and has all these fancy things. And I've got the one that I just carry in my bag all the time, all day, every day, because it is unacceptable if I were to like run out of power when I needed it most. So yeah, that is one of the services that is provided, whether it's through a generator or whether it's through those little power banks. Key, absolutely key. And we're also seeing more and more solar-based systems. And that's super important, not only because, green response is a serious and important thing, but for example, when you have one of these generators, you know what else you need? You need fuel, you need oil, right? You need to secure the fuel, you need to secure the oil. It makes a ton of noise. You run a generator 24/7, it's a disaster. Everybody my age and older basically has hearing problems because we just spent too much time around sirens and generators. So a lot of these solar-based systems they're going to change the way we work. We can put out these really fancy battery and solar panel systems that recharge during the day, and we can run 24/7. We don't need fuel, we don't need oil. Now, the technology is not quite there yet, And so every humanitarian responder is still going out there with a generator, right? And if you've got to power a hospital, you need more than a few solar panels. So you get those trailer ones on the left, and that little Honda 220 that you see on the bottom right, that's like and again, one of our kind of trusty pieces of kit that everybody carries around with. And you might have seen them strapped to the back of a food truck, and it's not for nothing. They're good little generators. They don't make too much noise, and they're reliable and easy to use. So power is another piece of, the tech that we use quite a bit. All right. Any questions before I go on? Before I get into some of the problem parts? All right. Okay. So operational problems. What goes wrong? Besides everything, besides, like any possible thing that can go wrong. So I'll try to think about things that can go wrong in like three kind of layers. One of them is like the governance layers. The other one is, and that's like laws and regulations, and they're real. These things cause problems for us at the operational level. The other one is operational. These are kind of things that are like, it's not quite laws and regulations, and it's not like small minor stuff that cause problems. So this is things like the impact of the storm itself, destroying power poles, or floods, knocking the cellular network offline, logistics, making logistics complicated. All of these things are kind of operational level problems. They affect everybody in the operation. And then there's tactical types of problems that we run into. Things like the conditions, the reality of the work that we work in, and human problems. Sadly, human problems are very, very much a real thing. So I'll kind of go through some of these. I don't have any cool pictures for you about governance, laws, and regulations, but I'll just point out that it's a real issue for us. For example, most countries have import controls about what technology can be brought into the country and used in that country. Certainly the United States, right? But not just the United States. Most countries have rules about what technology you can bring in. There was an earthquake in Myanmar or Burma a few years ago, and we're not allowed to bring in satellite-based technologies into those countries. That was how the government of Myanmar at the time, one of the ways that they retain some control is that they control the technology that can be used in their countries. So they weren't allowing us to bring any of those fancy satellite-based systems, satellite phones, VSATs. We weren't even allowed to bring those in. That's a real thing. And in a lot of cases in conflict zones, there's all sorts of regulations about what technology can be used in different countries. And you have to be careful. You have to be very, very careful about what technology you bring in. Maybe some of you have heard about these Starlink systems being brought into Ukraine, and they've been really, really important. But what you're not hearing a lot about on the news is that you got to be really careful if you're using one, because guess what? The Russians can absolutely triangulate your location based on the use of these Starlink systems. So you got to be really, really careful about the technology that you bring in, right? Now, that said, we're not all crazy, right? We recognize like, hey, there's a disaster. Maybe we should loosen some of these rules when there's a disaster. So there's something called the Tampere Convention. And it was signed by like over 60 countries and being ratified by more in 1998. The US has even signed it, but just, of course, hasn't ratified it because we're not big on ratifying international agreements. But the Tampere conventions allow us to bring in tech when we normally wouldn't. And that especially applies to a lot of the radios. As you can imagine, the frequencies in the air are heavily regulated in just about every country. So the Tampere conventions kind of loosen a lot of the rules around frequency usage. So that is one of the solutions to some of these governance level problems. Now, not only are there some problems about bringing gear into countries, but there are export controls too. The US government has some very, very serious rules about what technology can be exported for use in what countries. How many of you have heard of OFAC? OFAC sanctions, OFAC controls? Give me a thumbs up if you've even heard the term. No, okay. Well, you can Google it at some point. It's Office of Foreign Asset Control. And like all of these sanctions that you hear about, it doesn't just apply to banking and money and billionaire yachts. It even applies to tech. And it's a little bit scary in my job sometimes because let's say I'm working on an operation and there's a chance that some of my high-end telecommunications equipment ends up in Cuba or Venezuela. Well, I might not be breaking a Cuban law or Venezuelan law, but I might be breaking a US law. And it's super specific. Like if there is a microchip that I'm not allowed to import into Yemen, and it is part of a bigger system that I have no idea, I'm liable for that. So we really have to do our work ahead of time before we deploy from the United States. And of course, Europe has a similar set of rules about export restrictions to certain countries. So these are just kind of some of the examples at the governance level that can cause real problems for us, because we prepare and we train to work a certain way, and then a disaster or crisis occurs and we can't work that way. It's a real problem. And as I said, there's also all sorts of regulatory issues around frequencies. A lot of those radios I showed you, I told you that like there are trusty old reliables. Whoops. We have to be very, very careful about what frequencies we use, right? That's a heavily regulated space. So at the governance level, that's like a big piece of the problems that we have to deal with. Now let's get into more of the operational level type stuff. So as I said, the impact of the storm itself, or the earthquake, or the fire can do damage, right? This is Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And you know, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, fires, they can do damage that most people cannot imagine. Most of us, our brains protect us, and they do not allow us to imagine the most impossible catastrophic scenario. Your professor and I were actually working on a tripartite commission, North American Humanitarian Response Summit. And we're working with officials from Canada, Mexico, and the US to plan for catastrophic response planning. And these are high-end, experienced government officials, and they had a hard time imagining catastrophic scenarios happening in their countries, right? But I can tell you, it's when you see this stuff, when you see a giant boat 1 mile inland, 50 feet up in the trees, or you see a 600-pound steer 40 feet up on a power pole, you kind of understand like, oh, I am not in Kansas anymore. And that, I mean that metaphorically, because I think a lot of people in Kansas have seen what tornadoes can do, and they understand, right? So the damage to the physical infrastructure can have huge problems. And so I used Puerto Rico as an example. The hurricane, it knocked out power, it knocked out cellular coverage, it knocked out roads. Imagine how many problems that creates for us. Suddenly we have to clear roads. It increases our security and safety risks. There's no power, so we have to go everywhere we go. We have to have a generator. We have to store fuel and secure fuel. There's no cellular infrastructure. So if we want to, if we have any plans about using phones to communicate, that's out the window, right? So that's just something to consider. One second. Another thing, give me a thumbs up if you've ever been impacted by a disaster in the US, a hurricane, an earthquake, a fire, a flood. Give me a thumbs up if you've ever been around one, okay, so in the US, we face a lot of hazards, right? And we're a very well-prepared country, generally. And, let's say AT&T and Verizon are down. In the US, they might be down a couple days, week, right? But AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, these are, private sector companies that also have public sector responsibilities, and they're they're for-profit businesses. So they have a strong incentive to get up and running as quickly as possible. And they do. We are lucky in the United States. After a big destructive disaster in the United States, usually we get cell and power back up, maximum a week. In fact, if cellular coverage is not up a week later, people are freaking out. People are calling their congressman, right? That's not the case around the world. And lots of parts of Nepal after the earthquake, they were without connectivity for over a month. Big chunks of southern Haiti, they have not regained connectivity since Hurricane Matthew in 2016, right? So the infrastructure and resilience we have in this country does not always exist around the world. And that's something, just to be aware of. And logistics causes all sorts of problems, right? Disasters on islands, disasters on hard to reach places. I talked about Nepal, believe me, that was hard to reach. On the left, that's a shore in Haiti. The southern parts of the island, once the first few roads were destroyed, how are we going to get there? How are we going to deliver supplies? How are we going to plan? How are we going to coordinate? How are we going to get this done, right? And it may be that it's an island, or it may be that the flood is still there. So on the bottom right, that is also Haiti. It's a different disaster. But yeah, it was pretty hard for us to work when you've got water up to your knees all over the place. Where are you going to put the generator? Or are you going to set up your operations? How are you going to get things done, right? So, from a logistics point of view, it really just the shock makes things very, very complicated. These are a few more examples of kind of logistical problems. Driving through the mud. Here we couldn't get past this water. We had to hire 4 or 5 locals to help us just shovel dirt through this giant puddle so we could get our vehicles through, right? On the right, you have an ICRC. They built this like jerry-rigged raft to get across this river. And this was flooding in the southern part of Nigeria in 2018, when due to increased rains and due to a bunch of new dams that they were building, they just had these epic floods. And so, you can see, like, we even used this giant barge to move a lot of the humanitarian supplies. Pretty crazy, but these are some of the problems that we deal with out in the field. And then there's tactical level problems, right? I talked about kind of the operational level stuff that affects everything, like the damage or the shock, the logistics problems that creates. But tactically, there's tons of problems too. We are not working on like a sunny day in May in a golf course. We're working in the poorest countries on earth in the midst of the biggest catastrophes they've ever seen. It can be raining like crazy. I showed you guys some of the pictures of the floods. It can be hot. It can be cold. It can be, even the transport to get all your stuff there can create all sorts of damage. After an earthquake, people were still breathing in dust and debris and concrete stuff into their lungs for months afterwards. And guess what? These fancy electronics that we all carry around, they're not really built for this. I mean, you can put a fancy case on it if you want, but 103-degree heat, for sustained days, no. Okay. So on the top left, you see a picture of me and a buddy of mine, Pierre Richard de Meza. Yeah, we were setting up a VSAT. What I didn't mention earlier, it was about 110 degrees on that roof. And my laptop was so hot that I couldn't touch the trackpad. It was like touching a hot pan, right? Also, fun fact, Post-its fail at about 104 degrees. So when you're working in an operations center, you've got Post-its all over the place and it's 104 degrees in the op center, it's almost funny. You start just seeing them fall off the wall like leaves on a tree. And as I mentioned, there's like dust and debris in the air. And the picture on the bottom right, that's after the Nepal earthquake. Anybody who deployed to the Nepal earthquake had like this weird chest cough. We called it the Kathmandu cough for about 2 or 3 months afterwards. And then that destroys our tech too. I have a picture of this destroyed Samsung phone. I know it's the saddest thing ever. Rest in peace, Samsung. But that happens. You're loading big, heavy crates in and out of vehicles. Things get destroyed constantly, right? Most electronics are not built for disaster response, right? So, these are tough conditions that we're working in. I'll also point out that, like, this is kind of a random thing, but bugs can mess you up. On the right, you might not be able to see it, but inside of that white box I'm holding up, there is this giant cricket. This guy somehow hitched a ride home into a piece of our VSAT from Mozambique after tropical storm, after Cyclone Idai. So I get back to DC, cleaning up all our gear, and all of a sudden I'm like, we have a visitor? Is this some weird cricket from Mozambique, right? That kind of stuff is real. After Hurricane Haiyan, we opened a case that had all of our VSATs, and about 1,000 dead spiders fell out of that case. Gross, right? So these are all things that can, like, it's a small little thing, but you can spend 10 hours trying to figure out why that gear doesn't work. And it turns out because there's a spider crawling around inside of it, right? Another thing, look, even when cellular systems are working, a lot of times they're not really working. They're just saying that. And if they are working, they're working super slow at a super degraded speed. Now, a lot of us are experienced in working like that. What I'm showing you here is this guy's laptop. We did a speed test. He was connected at 420 kilobytes per second. Most modern phones would not even recognize that they are connected to the internet if that was the speed that they were getting. So in this case, we had 3 or 4 people working off of that VSAT that was giving us 420 kilobits per second, right? That's good enough to, like, send a few emails and receive emails, but man, you are not video chatting with your family, not on 420K. And most of our hardware is not configured to work in this environment. These phones that we all carry, they're built to work in high bandwidth environments. A lot of the software that we're using are built to work in high bandwidth environments. So people get out in the field with their phones and they're surprised that they don't work. They get out in the field with their corporate laptops where they can't change any of the settings, and their corporate laptops are trying to run updates and do all of this crap that you can't do out in the field. These are like the little things that can like totally trip you up. So one person's laptop is not configured right and they're hogging all the bandwidth for the operation. So you don't get info about vehicle movements, you don't get info about new developments in safety and security. Little tactical things like that can really, really, really mess you up. Last but not least, humans. We are a mess. Top right, this was a driver who'd been working for 18 hours straight, and it was our failure. It was our failure. We did not give our drivers enough rest time, and he got in a car accident. And so what did we have to do the rest of that day? Well, that day we did zero distribution of humanitarian assistance because we had to pick one car out of the ditch. We had to get another driver to the hospital. We had to, that kind of thing can slow you down. On the right, this was a truck that was not maintained properly. So, after a few weeks of banging up and over through some pretty rough roads, the axle broke. Now what, right? And in the bottom right, you can see there was a, kind of an ambush / riot on the streets. Humans have problems. This was in Haiti. We were going out to do an assessment of a community, and we had driven through this community several times without assessing them. And I guess this time they were sick of it. They're like, how come you're going to assess all these other communities and you haven't assessed ours? And they stopped us. And they were right. We should have communicated to them. We should have talked to them about what we were doing and why we were driving through each day. We should have started with them, right? But they stopped us, right? And in that case, we talked our way out of it. We used all of our important soft skills, but that could have gone worse, right? Not to mention responders themselves. And a lot of times this is what it looks like. Like on your left, that is a field kitchen. We were using that little kitchen to feed 24 people, that tiny little gas thing. And on the right, that was our shower. For those of you who are looking at this saying, that's not a shower, let me explain. What you do is you take this chair, with this folding chair, you sit on the chair and you get your bucket and you fill up your bucket with water, right? And then you put a little bit of water on yourself, you soap yourself up, and then you take your bucket with a cup and you clean yourself off. And people who are experienced responders, we're proud of the fact that we can shower in less than one bucket, because water is one of the most precious things you have out there, right? So imagine going 28 days, you're going hard, you're sweating, you're exhausted, and you're eating food from that kitchen and you're showering in that shower. Tough, right? You get tired. Plus, you're not necessarily sleeping in the best conditions. These are pictures from Haiti. The top left was my room. I was psyched because guess what? My room had electricity. This hotel had no roof, no running water, but for some reason, still can't explain, my room had electricity. And my room was the bathroom, so it was pretty sweet. But hey, the people that were down in the basement, they're sleeping on the floor in these mosquito nets, right? So you travel 30 hours, you show up, you're jet lagged, you're eating not much, you're working in awful conditions, you're not sleeping much. I wonder what that does in terms of your problem solving abilities, right? So humans, we mess up all the time. These are just more examples of like the conditions. On the top left, that's Nepal. After the second aftershock, none of us wanted to sleep in the hotel. We're like, hell no, I'll sleep in the grass. On the bottom right, that's kind of a classic group shelter, and that was in Puerto Rico after Maria. As I said, you're not eating well. This was my 40th birthday meal. I was in southern Nigeria responding to the floods. I got power, so I was able to boil water, and I had this delicious scrambled eggs with bacon, which was super risky because there's Sharia law there, and I probably shouldn't have bacon, but I didn't know that when I packed it. But I was pumped. That was a good one. And that was my 40th birthday meal, right? So you're working nonstop, 28 days, maybe more, maybe a little bit less. You're not eating, you're not sleeping, you're probably sick. It's tough. You're not making the best decisions. So how do we get ready for that? We recruit, we train, we equip, we do teamwork, and then ultimately we have to adapt and overcome. So who do we recruit? We recruit, all sorts of different types of people, people with experience, technical specialists, international experience. But the most important one is the one on the bottom of that list, problem solvers. People who just like love to solve problems. Everybody on our teams, they have 1,000 projects going on in their house. We've got people that hand make guitars. We got people that hand make drones. These are the types of people that like are all over the place. You like solving problems? This might be the kind of field for you. You like working with your hands and your head and your heart? This might be the field for you. Another thing we do, train. I mean, we practice all the time, because when you're out in the field on some rooftop and it's pouring rain at 1 a.m., not the time to pull out the manual, right? So we practice. Also, we equipment readiness. This is kind of what it looks like. We pack our gear, both our personal gear, our equipment, you know, we go through it. All of these cases are packed piece by piece. They have precise inventories. We know where it is. So when we get to some capital city and the helicopter to the affected area is leaving and we got to throw a bunch of crates in the back, or we got to throw a bunch of crates in the back of a canoe to go down some flooded river, or maybe the back of a donkey, we know exactly what's in each crate. We know how to use it. And every piece of kit is like a Swiss Army knife for us, right? So we're very, very meticulous about our equipment readiness. And teamwork. You know, I said it before, not just as a small like response team, but we work with the UN, we work with locals, we all support each other out in the field. Everybody who does this work is not doing it for themselves, they're doing it as an act of service to people, to other people in need, right? So we all come together to help. And of course, we adapt, we innovate, and we overcome, right? I'm sure you've heard that kind of stuff. We're like the worst MacGyvers on earth. We void every warranty. Do not sell anything to disaster responders. We will void the warranty. So whether it means like mounting stuff on a water tower, on a rooftop, which you see in Nepal in the top left, whether it means putting a bunch of ladders from some rooftops in Puerto Rico, or having dinner on top of a VSAT dish, or floating a vehicle across a river. Like sometimes you gotta do that kind of stuff. So because you know you have no choice, and there's no Amazon coming. Right? You can't go to Best Buy. You can't go to Home Depot. So you got to make do with what you've got, what you brought with you, what you can find around you, and you've got to improvise and adapt. Okay, I've been talking at you guys for way too long. I apologize for that. Again, I'm going to throw my email address up there in case any of you feel the need to reach out. And I'm sorry I cut it so short for Q&A, but thanks for listening.
Thank you. No, this was amazing. We do have a few minutes. Guys, do you have any last minute question? By the way, I really miss going back into the field. So I might reach out to you again now and see if you can help me out here. It's tough, but it's an amazing experience.
It is. It is tough. It's emotionally difficult. You know, you're traveling long ways, you're away from your family to do hard work in hard conditions. You're seeing and experiencing pretty tough stuff, and you're dealing with traumatized populations. But I think a lot of people who do this work, it's almost like a calling, right? You put up with that stomach bug that you've had for 2 months. You put up with that crook in your back, and the heat and the mosquitoes, because you know that you're serving others, and you're working to you know, alleviate human suffering, save lives. And you know, you come home from a mission and you're exhausted, and you have to think about your own transition back into your world. It's not so easy, but you have the satisfaction of, you know, doing something important. And you meet people that change your worldview. Every mission I change my worldview. It helps you kind of appreciate the diversity of the world. It helps you appreciate what you have. I joke all the time, like to this day, every time I just turn a faucet on in my house and I just get clean water that comes out of my faucet, I'm like, yes, it helps me appreciate little things. I mean, I pee into clean water. I clean my car with clean water, right? And, you know, I've been in situations where a liter of clean water was the most valuable thing on earth. And it helps me appreciate all of that. Helps me appreciate when I'm home. It helps me appreciate a nice, comfortable bed and diversity in my diet. All of these things. So it is hard, but you get a lot back.